Okay, point towards the road. Whatever it is, it ain't local.
Position?
I checked in the front and somewhere you're right.
Big out? Yeah, it's big. Only 25 years away.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niat here with Film and Comics Explained. And today, we'll be taking a look at the 1997 science fiction drama, Contact, which was directed by Robert Zemeckis, featuring an all-star cast including Jodie Foster, David Morse, Tom Skerritt, and Matthew McConaughey. Contact was based on the 1985 novel of the same name, written by the visionary Carl Sagan, who is an American astronomer, cosmologist, astrophysicist, and astrobiologist who would help popularize science amongst youths and turn generations of children like myself into curious junior astronomers with his humbling and awe-inspiring PBS television series, Cosmos, A Personal Voyage. The novel, which was the brainchild of both Sagan and famed author Anne Druid, whom he later married, was initially created as a screenplay, but when development of the film stalled, Sagan decided to convert the screenplay into a novel that explored humanity's first contact with a technologically advanced extraterrestrial race. Many years after the commercial success of the book, Robert Zemeckis was brought on board to direct Sagan's passion project. Not only is the film and its source material a plausible representation of our first contact with extraterrestrial life forms that were millions of years ahead of us, but the film also grapples with the complexities of geopolitics, religion, and science as humanity tries to figure out its place in the universe. With one of my favourite film introductions, Contact begins with a shot of Earth from space and an audio track of various samples of recognisable communications from our collective histories, before hurling out of our solar system at rapid speeds. Continuing further out of the Milky Way, the hypnotic trip takes us past thousands of galaxies before passing through the iris of a young Eleanor Arroway, the film's protagonist, who is practicing the craft of radio telecommunications. With a strong aptitude for both science and mathematics, coupled with encouragement from her father prior to his death when she was only 9, Arroway dedicated the rest of her life in the pursuit of reaching the furthest points in the universe with the hope of making contact. Working for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program, or SETI for short, she dedicated her early career to working at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. Guided into science and communication by her late father, she would use the facility's large radio telescope to listen to radio emissions from space in the hope that she might find evidence that life originated from outside of our solar system. Eleanor Arroway was actually based off of one of Carl Sagan's friends, Jill Carter, who was the former director of the Center for SETI Research, a similar position to the one Arroway plays in the film. Now, while she's working in Puerto Rico, she meets Simon Hurst, a spiritually abusive and deeply manified, and he is loosely based on the character featured in the novel. It's with Palmer that we see a continuous discussion between science and religion and people's pursuit for meaning. Later in the film, Arroway insists that there is no proof of God, and in response to that, Palmer simply asks her to prove that she loved her father, which leaves her at a loss for words. After having her funding cut by David Drumlin, the president's science advisor, who believes her search to be futile, Arroway receives the financial backing of a secret news very large array uninterrupted for many years. With the continued fear of government shutdown looming over its shoulder, under pressure from Drumlin, who threatened to end their contracts with the facility,
some things are just meant to be together. Dogs and tennis balls, chicken and waffles, unicorns and
Eleanor discovers a signal repeating a sequence of prime numbers, which appear to have been sent from the Vega star system some 26 light years away. With only a limited time that she could keep the very large array telescopes pointed at Vega, Arroway enlisted the help of international research facilities to confirm her find and monitor its progress. Feeling that the country's national security was compromised by her decision, Drumlin and their National Security Council, led by the tenacious Michael Kitts, attempt to take control of the project, just as her team discover another message embedded within the signal.
To the horror of everyone in the room, the message was essentially a video.
Yo, my bad, yo. Eating some cereal right now.
Which had team postulated had just been very strong enough to leave Earth's atmosphere, taking 26 years to reach Vega prior to it being transmitted back to Earth.
Alright, one more bowl there, I'm done.
Approximately 455 million years old, the star is a baby compared to our sun, which is 4.6 billion years of age. And it's due to this comparatively short primordial lifespan that Arroway and her team were alarmingly surprised that enough time had passed in the Vega system for intelligent life to have been developed. Further investigation of the message also revealed more than 60,000 pages of seemingly indecipherable data, which left the scientific community stumped. After inviting Arroway to meet him, Haddon, who used to be an engineer, explained that they were deciphering the pages in 2 dimensions, suggesting...
You ever seen the movie Contact? I did, but I didn't know it was written by Carl Sagan and his wife. That's pretty interesting.
Pages were written in 3 dimensions by an intelligence that favored efficiency. And it's this revelation that leads to her finding the primer and subsequently discovering the hidden schematics for a complex machine believed to be a form of transport for a single occupant. After much time deliberating on whether the machine was a Trojan horse or a transport device, the scientific consensus of it being the latter encouraged the commencement of its creation. And while the machine was being put together, many candidates from around the world, including Arroway and Drumlin, who had used a senior position to steal the life from Eleanor's discovery, are subjected to physical and mental aptitude tests prior to being interviewed by a special panel to determine who the lucky traveler would be. Costing $250 billion to build, the construction of the Vega machine was a result of funding from the leading countries of the world, which competed for contracts to aid in construction, and to have a representative from their country vie for the chance to travel in the machine. Although Drumlin is selected to be the designated traveler, an attack during the testing stages by an extremist led to the catastrophic destruction of the Vega machine, and the unfortunate deaths of many of the scientists who were working on it. Upon returning home, Ellie finds complex machines in her room, linking her to Haddon, who would become a resident on the Mir space station in an attempt to slow his terminal cancer down. It's here that Haddon reveals that the government had secretly built a second Vega machine in Japan by a company that had coincidentally recently been acquired by Haddon himself, who managed to convince them that Arroway was perfect for the voyage. Interestingly, in the novel, the transport pod is described as a dodecahedron device with 5 seats, and while the film kept its spherical dodecahedron shape, they did alter the script to have a single traveller. Although a lot of people were annoyed by this, I thought it was appropriate since we were experiencing the film through the eyes of Eleanor, as was implied by the opening of the feature. Ellie is then put into the transport pod, and after it's launched into the center of the machine, she instantly begins to travel through several wormholes, seeing multiple star systems, alien technologies, and a glimpse of a city on one of the distant planets. Arroway eventually detaches herself from the seat restraints to retrieve Palmer's compass, which had come loose from her neck, and is inadvertently saved by this, as the chair violently rips apart from its base before slamming into the pod's side, fulfilling Palmer's prophecy that the compass would one day save her life. Staring through the walls of the pod, its translucency revealed a beautiful celestial event to Arroway, who was slowly guided from her pod down to a sandy environment, similar to the one she drew of Pensacola as a child. What initially appears to be a mirage then approaches her, slowly moulding itself into a shimmering reflection of her father Ted, much to the shock of Arroway. This alien had essentially taken her thoughts, memories, and feelings from her mind in an instant, to greet her in a form that was most comfortable for her. The projection of Ted then explained that there were many other intelligent life forms in the universe that used the unique transport system she had just traveled through, many of which she sees on her journey through the wormhole before arriving at her current point in space-time. Although his race and many like them had been using the transport network to bring their civilizations together, none of them actually knew who built it, admitting that it had actually been constructed billions of years before their time. After explaining that this was humanity's first step in joining other spacefaring species, in a process that would take millions of years, Arroway is sent back to Earth as it became...
That's almost like, dang, I can't remember that one sci-fi video game I used to play. why won't it come to me? But anyway, they just described a similar type scenario. Well, this movie is way older than that video game, so the video game probably took it from this, where mankind comes across a ancient civilization that is highly advanced technologically, but some of the technology that this civilization has is even older than they are, and they don't really know where it comes from. So it's like, you know, an ancient people having even more ancient technology, but the technology is more advanced than anything that we could conceive of in our own imaginations. And that movie Contact, it basically describes the same thing. Humans make their first initial contact with a intelligent, technologically advanced race that sends them blueprints and schematics on how to make a device that will allow them to travel between the stars. And once meeting these new beings in person, they say, well, we don't know where this technology comes from. We use it, we understand how to use it and kind of how it works, but we didn't make it, and it's older than we can remember. So it's this whole perpetual thing about, you know, technology has been here vastly longer than we can imagine, and the progenitors of such technology has been long lost to the memories of all races in the cosmos. Very interesting plot indeed. And I watched that movie, like they said, it came out in '94 or something like that. I was a preteen. I was like 13 or 12 or 13 or something. No, probably like 14. But I might watch that movie again, yo. Contact. I do remember that it being pretty good, though.
Life forms in the universe that use the unique transport system she just traveled with the pod's side, fulfilling Palmer's prophecy that the compass would one day save her life. Staring through the walls of the pod, its translucency revealed a beautiful celestial event to Arroway, who was slowly guided from her pod down to a sandy environment, similar to the one she drew of Pensacola as a child. What initially appears to be a mirage then approaches her, slowly molding itself into a shimmering reflection of her father Ted, much to the shock of Arroway. This alien had essentially taken her thoughts, memories, and feelings from her mind in an instant, to greet her in a form that was most comfortable for her. The projection of Ted then explained that there were many other intelligent life forms in the universe that used the unique transport system she just traveled through, many of which she sees on her journey through the wormhole before arriving at a current point in space-time. Although his race and many like them had been using the transport network to bring their civilizations together, none of them actually knew who built it, admitting that it had actually been constructed billions of years before their time. After explaining that this was humanity's first step in joining other spacefaring species, in a process that would take millions of years, Arroway is sent back to Earth as it became clear that humanity was not yet ready. I mean, the destruction of the first vessel and the lack of transparency between the governments of the world and the people that they served was evidence enough of this. I also almost feel as though finding out more would have been beyond our scope of understanding. The alien explaining the workings of the universe to Eleanor would be like teaching economics to a toddler. The child obviously is yet to acquire the skills to process and comprehend all the information, making it an almost useless effort. Interestingly, in the novel, the 5 passengers, including Arroway, embark on the journey, and upon their arrival at Vega, they all go exploring the surreal beach-like environment and go through a similar experience as Eleanor, who was approached by an extraterrestrial in the guise of her late father. The alien eventually explains that the reason they had contacted humans was that they were involved in an ongoing project to alter the properties of the universe by accumulating enough mass in Cygnus A, which is a radio galaxy, to counter the effects of entropy. He also explains that the wormhole system was built by unknown precursors and hints at the potential discovery of artificial messages in transcendental numbers like pi. After arriving on Earth, she learns that from the perspective of everyone there, she'd merely dropped through the machine's rings and landed in the safety net. And though Arroway insisted that she'd been gone for 18 hours, only a few seconds had passed on Earth, with all of her recording devices showing nothing but static, most likely due to the electromagnetic forces that were powering the pod. A congressional committee which is formed to investigate the events begin to berate Arroway, suggesting that the Vega signal and machine were all a hoax, designed by the now deceased Hannon. Although Arroway admitted she could not prove her recollection of events had happened, she asked the committee and everyone watching her to accept the truth of her testimony on the plane, a sentiment who supports her through the proceedings and tells the world that he believed her. Several days after the committee hearing, Kit sent a White House official named Rachel Constantine, who revealed that although Arroway's recording devices only picked up static, they had recorded 18 hours of it, indicating that Eleanor had indeed gone on a journey. And in the novel, after working on what the alien had told her about messages and transcendental numbers, she develops a program to compute the digits of pi to unprecedented lengths, and discovers a circle rasterized from zeros and i's that appear after 20 decimal places in the base 11 representation of pi. This was an incredible find, as it not only provided evidence of her journey, but also suggested that intelligence was behind the universe itself. Despite Sagan's outspoken skepticism and agnosticism, and though science and religion seem to be at odds at each other at the beginning of both the book and film, by the end they seem to arrive at the same place. Whatever your views on religion and science, watching the movie and reading the thought-provoking book with an open mind will provide you with ample opportunity to question your own beliefs in the ultimate search for meaning. Unfortunately, the great Carl Sagan didn't get a chance to see the movie, passing away a mere 6 months prior to the release of the film that he had worked on for nearly 2 decades. Though his light was extinguished, Sagan has been immortalized by his life's work and the influence he had on young minds, daring us to dream and helping us realize that although we were small, we were surely not alone. If you haven't seen the film or read the novel, I've left a link to where you can purchase them below. Well, that's all for today, folks. Thanks to all of you guys who requested we take a look at Contact. And if there's any other stuff you'd like me to check out, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Nihat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
Saying to myself, how are we going to win this thing, boys?
No, it's a rhetorical question.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you, Dave. This is Mars, the red planet. Here's a closer view with one of NASA's incredible rovers. Renowned mathematician and theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking says threats to the Earth are so dire that we need to prepare to escape to Mars or even farther. I share Professor Hawking's concerns about threats to the Earth, but I think we should assume that our descendants won't have anywhere else to live besides right here. Now, I don't mean that NASA won't send astronauts to Mars, or that we shouldn't explore space or anything like that. I just mean I think that it would be prudent to assume that everyone in future generations, aside from perhaps a few explorers, will live right here. If I'm right about that, we ought to take care of this planet. Besides, who wants to go to Mars? I'd rather be here. Here, it's pretty nice outside, it's pretty. You don't need an oxygen tank to go outside. You don't need a spacesuit. And if you rip your clothes when you're outside, it's an annoyance. It's not a life-threatening catastrophe. So I'm going to try to make 3 points. First, I'm going to explain why I think it would be wise to assume that our descendants bulk of people in the future will live right here on this planet. And I'll argue, therefore, that we ought to look after the life support capacity of this planet. And then finally, my main point is to argue that lately in the United States, we have not been doing a good job of that because we've been tricked. We've been tricked into rejecting good environmental protection ideas on the basis of biased tests and double standards that we would know better than to accept in other circumstances. So I hope that after you hear this talk, these biased tests and double standard arguments will jump out at you, and you'll point them out to other people, and you'll help your nation and your society make better environmental decisions. But first, why do I think we shouldn't assume that we'll be able to go to Mars? Well, for several reasons. The first is the least of my concerns, but it's still a relevant concern. We don't have the transportation technology for people. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if NASA overcomes that, but I wouldn't bet everybody's future on it either. A second reason is space travel is remarkably expensive. This is the International Space Station. It's 250 miles up. Believe it or not, the United States pays Russia $80 million to get one astronaut back and forth to the International Space Station. $80 million. The biggest building on this campus, and it's a big, beautiful building, costs a little more than $30 million to build, so less than half as much. Meanwhile, as you know, we have more than 7 billion brothers and sisters on this planet, billions of whom live on a few dollars a day or less. They can't afford a short taxi ride, let alone a ride on a spaceship. And the more fortunate among us are not providing for their basic needs to be met in all cases. It seems unlikely that we're going to pay for their space travel. This high expense of space travel is presumably why even enthusiasts like Professor Hawking imagine that only a couple of thousand people could ever go anywhere else. A couple of thousand people is roughly 1 in a million people. That won't do much good for the literally thousands of millions who would be left behind. Another reason I think we ought to assume that our descendants will live right here is because we don't know how to make self-sustaining ecosystems out of big dead rocks. So this diagram is meant to show Mars becoming like Earth, not literally, but taking on the self-sustaining ecosystem property unique to our planet. Ecosystems are incredibly complex. We know some things that will destroy them. We know maybe some of their requirements, but the gaps in our understanding of ecosystems are vast. We have no idea how to make ecosystems, self-sustaining ecosystems, out of non-living components. In fact, we can't even make a single living cell out of non-living components. So I don't think we should bet our descendants' future on the ability to overcome this challenge. Another reason I don't think we should count on going to Mars is the reason to escape to Mars. And keep in mind, I'm not talking about exploring or NASA sending some astronauts, but escaping en masse to Mars is because the reason to do so would be because we caused so much damage to this planet. In other words, we failed to sustain the life support capacity of this planet. But to go to Mars and succeed on Mars, we would not only have to manufacture life support capacity on Mars, we would also have to sustain that life support capacity. But if we can't do it here, what reason is there to think we could do it there? I can't see any reason. So if we can sustain the life support capacity here, we ought to just do that where everybody will benefit. And if we can't sustain the life support capacity here, it's not going to do any good to go to Mars because we won't be able to sustain it there either. So a younger friend of mine, I don't know much about video games, I'm too old, but a younger friend of mine said, sustaining the life support capacity of Earth, that's like beating the video game on easy mode, but creating ecosystems on Mars and sustaining those, that's like trying to beat the video game on expert or maybe even impossible mode. So I think the obvious conclusion is not to damage the life support capacity of this planet. Well, how are we doing in that regard? Not very well. There are millions, literally millions of people doing great work, and there are all kinds of minor victories, but the major trends are in the wrong direction. We are depleting forests, depleting fisheries, depleting aquifers, depleting the soil. We're changing the chemical composition of both the atmosphere and the oceans and causing climate change. And maybe most profoundly of all, we're depleting biodiversity and the ecosystems upon which both we and that biodiversity depend. The trends are in the wrong decision. There must be something terribly wrong with our decisions. We're damaging the life support capacity of the only place in the universe known to support life. Now, we haven't always made bad decisions. My parents' generation, the grandparents of the students in the audience, made some very good decisions. This is a graph of the number of major environmental laws passed in the United States per decade since the 1950s. And what you see is the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were the heyday of passing environmental laws. Some of you who are younger may not even realize what these laws did. This is a picture of air pollution in Beijing today. Believe it or not, American cities looked like this in the 50s and 60s, but they don't anymore thanks to one of those laws, the Clean Air Act. Likewise, incredibly, rivers used to be so polluted in many American cities that they literally caught fire. But they don't anymore thanks to the Clean Water Act. So these laws worked. But something has happened since then. Since the 1990s, this country has passed no major environmental laws. There has been no major progress during the lifetimes of today's students, even graduate students in some cases. Well, environmental protection threatens profits of environmentally damaging activities. And some, certainly by no means all, but some people whose profits are threatened, therefore object to environmental protection. And what's happened since then is they've tricked us into not passing any laws. See, they can't argue that environmental protection is a bad idea or that damage to the planet is a good thing. Nobody's going to buy that. And they can't argue that their profits are more important than the planet. Nobody's going to buy that. So they have to take a different approach. And the approach they've taken is to work behind the scenes to manipulate public debate. And they do this several ways. I have time to talk about 4 ways that we've been tricked. And for short, to help you remember them.
Yo, this dude is smart as shit, yo. He started off talking about why we won't go to Mars and all the reasons about the sustainability of life on a hostile foreign planet and all these other reasons why, and then his ultimate reason why is because we've been tricked by the corporations. Yo, this motherfucker then took the whole spin and brought it back around to the corporations, lobbyists, and big government. I like how he did that. Very smart, bro. Very, very smart.
I mean, refer to them as certainty, freedom, jobs, and profit. Let's begin with certainty. No matter how good our understanding of an environmental problem, opponents of environmental protection will argue that we just don't understand it well enough to act. This has been going on with regard to climate change for decades, even though well over 90% of qualified scientists think we do understand it well enough to act. This is a double standard. In other circumstances, we understand the danger of putting off decisions indefinitely. If you're ill, if one of your loved ones is ill, you go to the physician, you expect the physician to analyze the situation carefully, examine the patient, run the necessary tests, and come up with a treatment plan, but not put off years and years and years before deciding what to do, running more and more and more tests, because the patient could die in the meantime, right? Students in the room, I hope you considered your college choice options carefully, but what you didn't do is you didn't spend years and years and years at home after high school studying colleges in more and more gruesome detail, right? If my sons had done that, guess what? They'd be home, I'd be driving them crazy, right? And if everybody did that, all the colleges and universities would have closed, right? Because everybody'd been home studying. So, not studying colleges. So in normal circumstances, we understand that delay and indecision is dangerous and has a cost. But when it comes to environmental issues, we get paralyzed. We made this mistake over and over. We made this mistake for a long time with regard to stratospheric ozone depletion, and with regard to acid rain, and with regard to the health effects of smoking for decades, right? By the way, the history of this is really well documented in a book called Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. So we're making this mistake now with climate change. This is a double standard. In other circumstances, we know we can't delay decisions until we have perfect understanding. We need to make decisions in a timely fashion. But with regard to environmental problems, we get paralyzed. Another flawed argument.
It's an old dude talking to some young college kids and telling them like, yo, these old dudes are fucking lying to you guys. Y'all only got one fucking planet. Y'all motherfuckers need to start taking care of this shit, or making, your college kids, you're at the voting age now. You can start getting into certain parts of local government and federal government if you like, and y'all gotta make changes where we save our planet, yo. Cause going to Mars sound good, but mostly everybody's gonna be here. So if you let these big companies keep fucking depleting the forest and polluting the oceans and shit, making more animals go extinct, bees are dying, then y'all gotta do something. But these old motherfuckers don't give a fuck about this planet, yo. And then when everybody's all like, "Oh, global warming," who's creating this shit? What corporations are working to produce such a caustic product just for a profit, not caring what it does, the processes of making their product does to impact our environment. Cut all the trees down. Fuck, we need wood. It's like, really? And then we're programmed into this materialistic state of being where we always want, mine. And it's like, it's so weird. And it's justified because people want stuff. But they gotta have their soda. You gotta have their cell phones in their SUVs. Yeah. Nobody's not gonna live without that.
Has been used as a basis for rejecting good environmental ideas are appeals to freedom. When environmental protection is proposed, opponents will argue that it would infringe upon freedom. And they're right. It would infringe upon one type of freedom. It would infringe upon freedom to damage the environment. They never seem to mention that it would do so in order to protect freedom from environmental damage. So environmental protection works exactly like the prohibition on smoking in this room. Because of that prohibition, we're all free to breathe clean air. So when you hear appeals to freedom, ask yourself, is the speaker or the writer only considering freedom to damage the environment, or are they considering all the relevant freedoms? Freedom to damage the environment, but freedom for everybody from environmental damage. We make exactly the same mistake with regard to jobs. When environmental protection is proposed, opponents will argue that jobs will be lost in affected industries. Nowadays, one hears this most often with regard to attempts to shift to clean renewable energy sources. Opponents argue disparage this as a war on coal, Well, I don't mean to make light of lost jobs. However, in that particular instance, for example, there are already more jobs in the solar energy industry than in the coal industry, right? So if somebody is really motivated by jobs, they ought to be an enthusiast for solar power. Again, this is a double standard. The folks that object to environmental protection don't object to other societal developments and initiatives that cause job losses. For example, they don't object to entrepreneurship or technological innovation, but entrepreneurship and technological innovation lead to new products and new industries, which make old products obsolete and put old industries out of business. But you won't hear any complaints about that. Just jobs lost from environmental protection, even if more jobs are being created as a result of the environmental protection. And the last one of these double standards that I'd like to mention is insistence that environmental protection turn a short-term profit, as if it were, say, a business investment in expanding a toy factory or a smartphone app. Now, sometimes environmental protection does turn a short-term profit. For example, this college, Austin College, has cut its greenhouse gas emissions by nearly half over the last several years. Nearly half. in the course of doing that, we've saved almost, not quite, but almost $500,000 a year. Well, how is that possible? Well, you see, part of the way we've cut the greenhouse gas emissions is to learn to use energy more efficiently in running the buildings. And so we don't have to buy as much energy. And because we don't have to buy as much energy, we save money. So we cut our greenhouse gas emissions and save money at the same time. It wasn't even very hard. But good environmental protection ideas can be rejected if they're required to have an immediate cash profit like that. Often, important societal decisions require an upfront investment and then a payoff over the long term. Again, this is a double standard. We don't expect major decisions in other contexts to turn a short-term profit. We don't expect grade schools to turn a short-term profit. We don't expect basic medical research to turn a short-term profit. We certainly don't expect space exploration to turn a short-term profit. If we did, only wealthy children would have schools to go to, and we wouldn't do any basic medical research or cure any diseases, and we wouldn't be talking about whether we could escape to Mars because we wouldn't do any space exploration. So this is a fourth double standard. So I've talked about 4 objections that are used as a basis for rejecting good environmental protection ideas. Fortunately, my parents' generation didn't fall for these arguments, or our cities would still look like Beijing does today. So my task for you is to watch for these arguments. When you hear them, point them out to others, because as long as these tricks continue to work, we'll continue to fail to make good environmental decisions and continue to grind away at the planet's life support capacity. But once the tricks no longer work, environmental protection progress will resume. So I want to leave you with 2 final thoughts. The first one is, this is actually good news. We could make a great deal of progress if we would simply reject biased arguments and double standards and thereby make wiser decisions. And finally, I think our country could use some sort of noble challenge to get behind. And I can't think of anything better than leaving our descendants, all of our descendants, and everybody's descendants, a healthy planet. Thank you.
So about 20 years ago, I was looking with my little brother at the night sky. And we didn't normally get to look at the night sky like the one I'm showing on this slide because we grew up in Chicago and the lights from the city drowned out the stars. So most nights all we could do is count the stars. But on this night there was a lunar eclipse. And so we were out there enjoying the majesty of the sky. And my brother turned to me and he said, "You think there's anybody out there?" And I wasn't an astrobiologist then, I was a college student, but I thought about it and I said, well, there's a lot of stars, and at least some of those stars must have planets, and at least some of those planets must have the conditions for life. And so yeah, I guess at least there's a few planets out there that have life. And I think that's how a lot of us think about that problem of are we alone? My job as an astrobiologist, as a scientist that thinks about that question, is to turn that train of thought into hypotheses that we can test with data and observation. And there's really 3 hypotheses I made there in my random ponderings to my brother. First, that stars are suns that have planets around them. Second, that some of those planets have conditions that would allow for global, breathing, pervasive biospheres. And third, that some of those planets that could have those global, pervasive biospheres actually do have life. 3 separate hypotheses. Today I'm going to talk about how, in the 20 years since then, the data that scientists, specifically astronomers, have collected has revolutionized our understanding of those first 2 hypotheses and essentially confirmed them to be true. And how in the next 20 years, we're going to confirm the 3rd hypothesis or fail trying by getting a large enough sample to know that if there isn't life out there, we know how lonely we are. So I'm going to talk about the last 20 years in 2 ways, or in 2 properties of planets. The size of the planet and how much energy the planet gets from the star. On the vertical axis of this line, you have how big the planet is. Big ones are on top, little ones on the bottom. On the horizontal axis, you have how much energy the planet gets from its host star. I have hot planets on the left of this line. I like thinking about the sun being on the left just because that's how we always learn these things as mobiles as kids. So just imagine the star being on the left and things close to that star being fried. Now I put the axes in this way because this is related to that habitability question. I'm not talking about any kind of life. I'm talking about a specific kind of life. Remember, I want testable hypotheses. I want to know if planets are out there that not just are inhabited, but are so pervasively inhabited that the signals from life can be detectable across interstellar space. Now, if you ask me what kind of planets to look for, I actually think of a different analogy. I think about if one of you in the audience, who I don't know, asked me where to find your keys, I would say, well, look in the pants you wore yesterday, look in the jacket you wore yesterday, look under your coat rack and look under your nightstand and look under the couch cushions. Now, I tell you those things not because I know you have a couch or pants or a jacket, but I tell you those things because that's where I lose my keys and that's where I find them, right? And so if we're looking for life on other worlds, as astrobiologists, the first thing we do is we look at all the places on Earth that there's life. And in the hottest, in the driest, in the coldest, in the deepest places on Earth, we have found life so long as there's liquid water in that environment. And so when I think about global biospheres, that's why NASA's had this follow the water strategy. Now, for these extrasolar planets that we want a strong biosphere from, that means we want global water. That means we want oceans. And that's where these axes come into play. Oh, I should say, I've got the solar system here for scale. Pluto's not on here. not because Pluto's not a planet. I think it is, but it's just not on the scale that I'm showing, okay? So the solar system's on here. We know of these 9 planets. And if you get too close to the star, we know that it's too hot because those liquid water oceans would boil, they turn into a steam atmosphere. We think this happened to Venus once upon a time. Conversely, if you're too far away, you get too cold. Now, you're not too cold for life per se, right? There can be life on Enceladus and Europa and these icy satellites in the outer solar system. Heck, there might be life on Pluto for all we know. And I hope we look for life on planets like this that have some reservoir of water near or under the deep under the surface of those worlds. But that kind of life is not the kind of life that we're going to be able to detect with telescopes across the vast distances of interstellar space. We need orbiters, we need rovers, we need samples back from these worlds to look for life on them. We're not going to be able to see it in these planets because they don't have atmospheres to retain the signals that life is going to give off. I'll talk about that later. But you can be too cold, not for life in general, but for the kind of life that we want to look for, the global pervasive life. You can also be too small. If you're too small, you're like the moon. The moon actually gets the right amount of energy to have oceans on it, but it has no atmosphere. And if you don't have an atmosphere, you can't retain an ocean. On the flip side of that, you can be too big and you can be like the gas giants of our outer solar system, which just have too much atmosphere for water to be stable at the surface. But between those 4, between the too hot and the too cold, the too big and the too small, you've got this blue box. It's the happy place. It's the habitable zone. Planets that we discover that have properties that fall inside this box are ones that could have global oceans stable at the surface for long periods of time, for geological and astronomical amounts of time. Those are the worlds that we think could have big, robust biospheres that would give off signals we could detect from far away and use that to test the hypothesis of are we alone, or that we are not alone. So this is where we were in 1996. We had 9 planets back then in our solar system. We know 6 worlds beyond our solar system. And if, like me, you think Pluto is a planet and you're a little bit upset at not being called a planet anymore, don't worry. Because we now have a lot more planets that we know of beyond our solar system. Over 1,000 have been confirmed in the last 20 years from the hard work and the tenacity of the engineers, developing instruments and space flight telescopes that have detected hundreds, actually more than 1,000 worlds beyond our solar system. And this doesn't even include the planet candidates that we haven't yet confirmed, but we're pretty sure are planets. If we include those on the chart, this is what it looks like. This is a dramatically different scenario from the one I showed 2 slides ago, where we knew of fewer planets beyond our solar system than we did inside of it. We have orders of magnitude more data. We've also gotten better at detecting the smaller planets. We now know of planets that are about the same size as Earth, that get about the same amount of energy from their host star that we get from the sun. In other words, we know of planets that sit in that blue happy box that could have oceans and pervasive global biospheres. Now, almost all of the data I just showed comes from the Kepler spacecraft. That's a telescope that's orbiting the Earth right now. Actually, it's in its own orbit around the sun. It's in space, and it's been looking for most of its mission at one patch of sky about the size of your hand. And I say that because it means that most of the dots I showed on that diagram came from a patch of sky about this big. So if you go out tonight and you look at the night sky, put your hand up and realize that there's thousands of worlds hiding behind your hand. That's different. It's a different place. It's a different night sky than we had 20 years ago. We also have learned to expect the unexpected. We know super-Earths, planets bigger than Earth and smaller than Neptune, we don't have in our solar system. We thought they would be rare, so of course they turned out to be one of the most common kinds of planets out there. We know of these planets like Kepler-16b, which would have a poetic double sunset because it's one planet orbiting two stars at the center of the system. So as the one sunset, so does the other one. And astronomers thought that was impossible. Well, most astronomers thought it was impossible. I always thought that these planets existed, but that's because I was looking at a different source literature than they were. So we have to expect the unexpected. We also have to look to visionaries in science fiction and other places for some motivation sometimes. And now when I look at the night sky as a result of all this, if I'm there with my brother, well, first of all, I look at it differently, because if I'm doing it now with my brother and my sister, I'm doing it with our daughters as well, and I'm probably looking down more than I'm looking up. But I also now know that the night sky is different. I know things about it that we didn't know as a society 20 years ago. Instead of saying, well, there's a lot of stars out there and surely some of them have planets, I can say there's a lot of stars out there. And if we count them, we know that on average, if we crunch the numbers, every star on average has a planet. And about 1 in 5 stars has a planet that has the conditions that could host global biospheres. So if I count 10 stars, and there's a lot more than 10 on this slide, if I count 10 stars, I counted 10 planets and 2 planets that could harbor life. So those first 2 hypotheses have been confirmed, but that third one hasn't. And that's what the next 20 years are about. Now, there's 3 kinds of challenges we're going to have to overcome to change our view of the night sky again. A technological challenge, a scientific challenge, and a societal one. This is not a mistake. The slide I'm showing you has a pale blue dot on it, which is what we want to find and what we want to analyze. But you're probably having trouble seeing it right now because you're blinded by the white photons coming from the rest of this slide. Planets are dim. Stars are bright. In fact, the light from the planets that we want to grab is actually just reflected starlight from the host star. And the planets and the stars are right next to each other. And as a result, for every photon we get from the planet we want to see, we're going to get 1 billion photons from the star unless we cancel them out. And we have to cancel out those billion photons from the star without canceling out that one precious photon from the pale blue dot we're looking for. That's a very hard technological problem. Now, even if we figure that out, that pale blue dot is going to still be extremely pale. And it's hard to see. You still might not be able to see it. It's right there if you don't. And to see dim things, if we see these worlds, they will be some of the dimmest, faintest things we've ever observed with any instrument ever built. And to view faint things, there's 2 things you can do. You can expose in a camera. If you're taking a picture at night, you can expose for a longer time, or you can get a bigger camera. So as astronomers, we like to build bigger telescopes. The Hubble Space Telescope has been in flight for 25 years, which is a marvelous technological achievement on its own. It's about 2.4 meters across. I'm about 1.9 meters high, so I don't know, about here to the ground, from my hand to the ground, is about how big around Hubble is. The James Webb Space Telescope is going to be about a factor of 3 larger than Hubble. But we think that if you want to get a really good sample size and answer the question of are we alone, or at least know how lonely we are, we need a bigger telescope than even what the Webb is going to give us. And we also need that technology to cancel out the starlight. And that's something that right now is called the HDST, which stands for the High Definition Space Telescope. Don't worry about memorizing, because I'm sure the name will change at least 2 or 3 times before this thing ever actually flies. But the thing here, the reason I point this out is because we're not counting on miracles. I have nothing against miracles. I told you I grew up in Chicago. I'm a Cubs fan. I was raised on miracles, okay? And I'm hoping for one this October. But in NASA, we're not in the business of relying on them. We're in the business of steady technological progress, leveraging the things that we're already doing or have already done. So we look at Hubble and how it's been in operation for 25 years. We look at the Webb telescope and how it teaches us to build bigger telescopes. We look at Kepler, which I mentioned earlier, and another mission called TESS, which is going to do similar science to Kepler that tells us what is out there in the universe in terms of the planet populations that we're going to be looking at. And we're looking at the WFIRST telescope, which we'll start building after Webb is finished. That's going to start developing the technologies to do that difficult problem of blocking out the starlight without losing any precious photons from the planet. So that's the first challenge. If we overcome it, we can build something that looks like this and get Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. And Sagan was very poetic about this. And he talked about how everything that we've ever done as individuals or as a society or as a biosphere on this planet has happened on this one tiny dot. And that's really lovely to think about, but when I think about it as a scientist, and I think I have to look at that dot and tell you whether or not there's life on it and do it with some scientific rigor, that's a hard problem too. That's the scientific challenge. Now the way we're going to solve that is we're not just going to have that one pale blue dot, we're going to split that blue color up into a full spectrum of colors from that world. And we're going to look for the telltale fingerprints of certain gases like oxygen and methane. I rely on oxygen and methane a lot as biosignatures. The reason is it's like college students and pizza, okay? If there's a lot of college students in a room and there's pizza in the room, you know someone just delivered the pizza because the college students eat it pretty quickly. From that, you can ascertain that there's a pizza delivery restaurant nearby because, let's be honest, students don't make their own pizza. So by the presence of college students and pizza together, you can figure out that there's a pizza restaurant nearby. Similarly, if there's oxygen and methane in a planet together, you know that there's life there, or at least we think that there's life there. And the reason is because oxygen and methane also destroy each other rapidly. And so you have to replenish them rapidly, and the best replenishment mechanism is life. There's ways to make oxygen without life, there's ways to make methane without life, but to have them in the atmosphere together is almost impossible unless you've got biology making those gases at the surface. And it would have an imprint on the planet's spectrum of colors. This is actually Earth's spectrum here, and you can see the presence of oxygen and methane and other gases in that spectrum of colors. Now I worry about this a little bit because 20 years ago, when I was chatting with my brother and when astronomers were announcing the discovery of the first planet around a sun-like star, we were also announcing from a different part of the agency evidence for life beyond Earth. We claimed, evidence in these fossilized microbes from a rock that used to sit at the Martian surface. Now, immediately thereafter, and certainly in the 20 years since then, there's been a lot of pushback from the scientific community. And I think the consensus now would be that the evidence in this slide, in this picture, and in this rock for life is just as well described by non-biological processes. So that tells us that although life could have been present in that rock, there is no solid evidence for life in that rock. And I worry about that. I don't want to call up the president and say, Madam President, I found evidence of life. And have her call a press conference, and then 6 months later have egg on the face of myself and the other people on that team. I want to know for sure, or at least as sure as I can know. And to do that well, it's going to require something broader than just me and my team. It's going to require us talking to people from other disciplines, biologists, chemists, planetary scientists, people that study our own climate on this planet and how the biosphere interacts with our atmosphere here. We need to talk with the space physicists that understand how stars drive planetary climate and biology at the surface of the planet. This is an all-hands-on-deck problem. Now, we haven't solved that yet, but we have something in the works called Nexus you'll be hearing about for the next few years. The whole point to Nexus is to break down the stovepipes that we've set up in the past to fund detailed questions, to bring people that study those detailed questions together with those different perspectives. Now, if we do that, and we do that, the technical thing I think will be there, but there's one other challenge that we need to overcome that I think will help us overcome these other two challenges. And that is, when I walk into a room that works on one of these missions, when I go to a conference, to be frank, I see a lot of people that look like me. And that is a separate challenge in itself. I know a lot of geniuses that don't look anything like me, and so the fact that most of the people I work with look like me tells me we're missing a lot of geniuses in that room. It also is important because research has shown that diverse teams do better. They get the better answers more quickly and more efficiently than teams without diversity. So in addition to missing some geniuses, our team just isn't as strong as it could be when a bunch of people have the same backgrounds as me, some of the same privileges that I have, and so are predisposed to thinking like me and making the same mistakes that I'm going to make. So we need academic diversity. We need people from different academic backgrounds on this team and on these endeavors. But we also need better cultural and just overall life diversity on these missions. Okay, so if we can overcome that challenge, we're going to be able to build a better telescope. If we can build a better telescope, we're also going to get the data we need, and we're going to be able to analyze it to look for signs of life. And that's going to put us in a place where 20 years from now, I hope to be looking up with my brother and our kids at the night sky. And when he asks me if we're alone, I don't want to just pontificate about what could be out there. I want to look at him and say, yeah, that star right there, that is another sun that has a planet in orbit around it, that has the right conditions for life, and we've observed signs of life on that world. I want to be looking at that night sky in 20 years but I hope you're all looking at it with me. Thank you.
I know a lot of geniuses.
Tell you how special this is for me. I've worked, as Andy said, at NASA for 41 years. I was involved in a half a dozen successful missions to Mars. I presented over 500 presentations about the results in 50 countries around the world. And yet today is the first time they put makeup on my face before I gave the talk. So it's been a unique experience for me too. We've been talking a lot about passion and uncommon, those two words, and I want to tell you my passion. I was 12 years old in Brooklyn, New York, and Brooklyn, New York is known for its Brooklyn onions, as we heard earlier. And I happened to look at a textbook that just came to the library, and I saw something that left a tremendous impression. I saw this picture of planet Mars. It was taken with the Mount Wilson 100-inch telescope in California. And I remember staring at this picture and thinking about another world like the Earth. Is there life on it? What's this world like? And because of this passion for Mars, a year later, I was given by my grandmother a telescope, an astronomical telescope. And I started looking through the telescope, looking at Mars. Now, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and the uncommon part of my talk is here's a 13 or 14-year-old thinking he can do astronomy with a telescope in New York City. But fortunately, this passion remained, and I had a very interesting career, which I'll talk about. So after my first experiences with a small telescope in New York City, I was offered a job by NASA and accepted it. And several decades later, I was a major contributor to NASA's plan for getting to Mars. It's called the Human Exploration of Mars, the reference architecture number 5. That's because they did 4 earlier ones that didn't go anywhere. This is the front cover. This is the back cover. And when NASA announced that they were going to send humans to Mars and return them safely, unlike some private companies, which will just deliver them on Mars and leave them there, we will bring our astronauts back. The question NASA was asked is, why Mars? Why do we want to go to Mars? And in 2007, I was working at NASA headquarters in the Mars Exploration Program. They asked me to form and co-chair the committee to come up with a scientific rationale. So we spent 3 years, 30 of the top Mars scientists in the United States, Europe, and Japan, and we came up with a list of about 150 reasons, scientific reasons for getting to Mars. Because I only have 18 minutes, I can only talk about two of these reasons. The first is there past or present life on Mars? Now, clearly, the detection of life on Mars is a game stopper, a showstopper. It impacts everything, goes well beyond planetary science. If we find life on Mars today, and if we can show it's indigenous life that formed on Mars, it will make tremendous advances in our understanding of biochemistry and molecular structure of life, and it will provide information on the human body and how to treat diseases that we haven't even thought about. Because all forms of life on Earth, people who come to TED, elephants, giraffes, molecular scale, a biochemical scale, they're the same. They're packaged differently, but it's basically the same biochemistry, the same molecular structure. If we find indigenous life on Mars, is it the same? And that's a fundamental question of great importance, not only to the planetary scientists, but for medical researchers and so on. Second overarching question, what happened on Mars? We know that in its early history, Mars was very different than it is today. In its early history, Earth and Mars formed 4.6 billion years ago. It was a Tuesday, and the solar system formed. Now we know that early Mars was very Earth-like. Early Mars had a thick atmosphere, it had lakes, it had rivers, and it had an ocean that covered most of the northern hemisphere. Today, Mars is very different. Mars is inhospitable, no surface water on the planet, and a very, very thin atmosphere. What happened on Mars? And of equal importance, can this happen on Earth in the future? And this was just published less than 4 weeks ago. This is the early ocean on Mars, published in Science magazine. That's the northern hemisphere of Mars. The blue covered area is an ocean that covered about half of the northern hemisphere, and the ocean was at least a mile deep. And that's a very recent discovery. Now, scientists know that we have looked at the history of climate on Earth several million years back by looking at ice cores from the Arctic and Antarctic and glacial ice. Because in these ice cores, there are bubbles, and in the bubbles are trapped atmosphere, not today, but when the ice was formed millions and millions of years ago. So if we can get an ice core on Mars, we're talking about 1,000 feet deep, and bring it back to a laboratory, we can analyze it, and we can find the climatic history of Mars. And we can, for the first time, get clues as to why Mars experienced catastrophic climate change. We know robotic missions can't do this. Too complicated for a robotic mission. So these are just my two overarching questions. This is the northern ice cap on Mars. The history of the climate history of Mars is trapped in the water, frozen water, in this ice cap. Why humans as opposed to robotic missions? First of all, let me say, after working on a half a dozen robotic missions, we've learned a tremendous amount. Robotic missions have been excellent. We have learned much about Mars' atmosphere, surface, but they have their limitations. And one of the limitations is that everything that we do on a robotic mission has to be pre-programmed. And pre-programming assumes that we understand the environment. Now, the human explorer has a whole bunch of qualities that are not in machine probes at this point, like intelligence, ingenuity, adaptability, agility, dexterity, mobility, and speed and efficiency. A very well-known Mars scientist said that he can do in 2 hours what it takes a rover to do in 6 months, because he's on the scene, he can understand the geology, he can figure things out that we didn't know before, whereas a robotic mission, we assume we know the environment, and in a lot of cases we don't. Let me talk about mobility. The National Research Council Space Studies Board, which oversees NASA by law, has said mobility on a planet is the most important single parameter. Now, we just completed the first Mars Marathon about a week ago. NASA's Mars Exploration Rover Opportunity traveled 26.2 miles. It completed a marathon run on Mars. Unfortunately, it took 11 years. With what we're planning to send to Mars for human exploration, we can do that in a day or less, so we have great mobility. Why send humans to Mars? Why become a two-planet species? Well, there are threats to humanity, there are threats to planet Earth. I don't want to spend much